There is a moment recorded in the Gospel of Matthew that most people read past without stopping. Jesus, hours from the cross, turns to his captors and says, "Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at his disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" 12 legions. By Roman count, that is 72,000 soldiers, roughly the entire active duty strength of the United States Marine Corps today. These were not symbolic reinforcements. These were warriors who had stood in the presence of God since before the first human breath was drawn. And by the end of this video, you'll understand what those angels were doing while Jesus was dying, and why the order God gave them was the most agonizing command in the history of creation. Have you ever read that verse and actually stopped to imagine what 72,000 angelic warriors, ready and waiting, would have looked like? Picture 10,000 legions assembled, actually assembled, ranked, armed, trembling with readiness, watching the Son of God being led through the streets of Jerusalem toward a hill called Golgotha. Jerusalem at Passover held perhaps 80,000 people, roughly the crowd that fills the University of Michigan's football stadium on a Saturday afternoon. Noise, heat, the smell of livestock and incense and unwashed crowds pressed together in the narrow streets. And moving through all of it, a man carrying a crossbeam toward his own execution, while beyond the visible world, an army that dwarfed every force in human history waited for a command that never came. The command, when it arrived, was 3 words: stand down, watch, obey. Hebrews 1:14 describes angels as ministering spirits, sent to serve, to protect, to intervene. It is what they were made for. Michael had fought Lucifer himself at the foundation of heaven's order. Gabriel had carried the announcement of Christ's birth into a dark stable in Bethlehem. Raphael, the healer. Uriel, the guardian of Eden. These were not passive observers. They were warriors with an unbroken record of intervention, parting seas, closing the mouths of lions, striking armies blind. And now the greatest warrior among them stood with a sword he was not permitted to draw. So here is the question worth holding. Why would God, who parted the Red Sea, who sent fire from heaven at Elijah's prayer, who destroyed the armies of Sennacherib in a single night, choose not to intervene at the one moment in all of history that mattered most? Think about what that restraint costs. Americans understand something about trained warriors ordered to hold their position. Soldiers at Arlington National Cemetery who stand their post through rain, through brutal summer heat, through personal grief, because the mission requires it. The tomb of the unknown soldier has been guarded without interruption since 1937. Not one missed watch. That is what disciplined faithfulness looks like at the human scale. Michael's restraint on Golgotha was that, multiplied beyond any comparison we have language for. In the books of 2 Peter and Jude, the fallen angels, those who had broken covenant with heaven, were held in chains, awaiting judgment. The contrast is searing. Those who rebelled were bound. Those who remained faithful were free to act, and forbidden. The obedient angels were bound more completely than the disobedient ones, because their chains were made of love and trust rather than consequence. Why do we not move? Imagine a younger angel, call him Azrael, turning to Michael in the assembled host. His voice not rebellious, but broken. The question of someone who believes in the mission and cannot understand why the mission requires this. We watch, Michael would have said. We watch, and we trust what we cannot yet see. John 19:28 records Jesus saying, "I thirst." The creator of oceans, the one through whom every river and cloud and living cell of water was made, dying of thirst on a Roman cross. And for 3 hours, from noon to 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the land. Not metaphorical darkness, but actual reported darkness over Jerusalem in the middle of a spring day. The kind of darkness that stops conversation, that makes grown men go quiet, that feels like the sky itself is holding its breath. What was happening in that darkness defies language. The weight of accumulated human sin, every wrong decision, every broken promise, every act of cruelty committed across more than 5,000 years of human history, converging on one man, on one afternoon, on one hill outside Jerusalem. Theologians call it propitiation, but the word doesn't carry the weight of the reality. If you could gather every moment of darkness from every human life ever lived and compress it into 3 hours, that is the nearest we can come to describing what was happening on Golgotha. And then came the cry. Matthew 27:46. Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? The Son crying out to the Father with the words of Psalm 22, written 1,000 years earlier, describing crucifixion in precise detail before the Romans had invented it as a method of execution. 5 centuries before the first Roman crucifixion, David wrote of pierced hands and feet, a mocking crowd, soldiers casting lots for clothing. Every detail, written in advance, spoken aloud from the cross as it happened in real time. Not coincidence. Architecture. The silence of heaven in that moment was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of a plan so precise and so costly that a single act of intervention would have shattered it. God was not looking away. God was holding every angel in place so that what needed to happen could happen completely. And here is where that question finally lands. The silence was not the absence of a plan. The silence was the plan itself. The demons watching from that darkness made the mistake every overconfident army makes. They interpreted the enemy's stillness as weakness. They had miscalculated everything. When you hear that the silence was the plan, does that change how you read any silent season in your own life? John 19:30. It is finished. In Greek, a single word, tetelestai, stamped on paid debts in the ancient world, the direct equivalent of writing paid in full across the bottom of a bill. Not, I am finished. The debt is finished. Every sin, every failing, every moment of darkness any human being would ever carry. Settled. Permanently. The transaction that the entire history of the world had been moving toward. Complete. And then, Matthew 27:51. The veil of the temple, 60 feet tall, 4 inches thick, the height of a 6-story building, split from top to bottom, from heaven downward. The barrier between the presence of God and the rest of humanity, the curtain that only the high priest could pass once a year under strict conditions, torn open like a letter finally being unsealed after a very long wait. The earth shook. The rocks split. A Roman centurion, a man whose profession was execution, who had watched hundreds of people die and felt nothing, looked at what he had just witnessed and said out loud, in front of his commanding officers, "Truly this was the Son of God." 3 days. The tomb sealed with a stone scholar's estimate at 1 to 2 tons, roughly the weight of a full-size American pickup truck, guarded by Roman soldiers whose own lives were the legal guarantee of its security. The same military machine that had never once lost a guarded prisoner. And beyond the visible world, the angels stood watch, not in defeat, in anticipation, because Michael had heard the promise, and he had chosen at the cost of everything his nature demanded to trust it. Matthew 28:2. An angel descends, rolls the stone back, not with effort, but with authority. And the Son of God walked out, not stumbling, not fragile, not barely surviving, victorious, completely and irrevocably victorious. Every debt settled, every chain broken, Every calculation of the enemy exposed as the catastrophic miscalculation it always was. The restraint was the architecture of the rescue. The silence was not abandonment. It was trust operating at a scale that exceeds every comparison we have. We live in a world where the news from the Middle East reads like it was written in the book of Daniel, where ancient names, Israel, Iran, Babylon, are back on the front page of every American newspaper, discussed in living rooms by people who have been reading their Bibles for 50 years and quietly wondering whether what they're seeing is the beginning of something they were always told was coming. And in the middle of that uncertainty, the story of that Friday asks a question without a comfortable answer. Can you trust a God who sometimes orders you to be still? The same obedience God asked of those angelic legions, warriors who had the power to end the suffering in a moment, who chose instead to trust a plan they could not fully see. That is the obedience He asks of us. Not passivity, not resignation. The active, costly, deliberate choice to believe that the silence is not abandonment, that the waiting has a purpose, that what looks like the end of everything is sometimes the exact precondition for the victory. The angels obeyed. 3 days later, they understood why.